chasing of the wind, the substance of the form, so pale and thin. Let the veil of earth be stretched again. Oh, behold the holy. Trees clap their hands for you. Oceans, they dance for you. Heaven taunts the hearts of men. We can feel it from within. The beauty of it all, the mystery, the swelling of her voice, a rising sea. Trees clap their hands for you. Oceans, they dance for you. You are holy, infinite and holy. A billion suns rise for you. Clouds paint the skies for you. Mountains stand tall. Valleys bow down to you. Everything rising to sing all our songs to you. Oh, kings become fools for you, kingdoms to ruins for you. Vapor finds ground in you, music finds sound in you. Everything rising, everything rising, everything rising, everything rising. They come like dawn, like rays, like sunlight. Bring this world to life. They come like rain, like breath, like springtime. Bring this world to life.
songs and sowing wildflower seeds. Tell me what's the point in planting pretty things in these days of darkness and disease? The world is burning, have you not heard? She smiled and said, honey, I've lived long enough to learn that the time for flowers will come again. Maybe in 1 year, maybe in 10. There are days to spare will win. The time for flowers will come again. I have witnessed funerals and wars, worried mothers, empty shelves and empty stores. The storms will rage and the winds will blow, and you're gonna find out that you're stronger than you know. And the time for flowers will come again. Maybe in 1 year, maybe in 10. There are days to spare will win, but the time for flowers will come again. And when I woke up this morning, something deep had shifted. The sun was coming out and all the clouds had finally lifted. It's time to fix what's broken, all the willing and the able. When our honest work is done, we'll gather around the table. We'll hold each other's babies and pour each other's wine. Promise to remember that your fate's bound up in mine. The skies are clear now, the moon is new. Let's raise a glass, my friends, we've made it through. And the time for flowers has come again. I know it seemed the world would end. There are days to spare did win, but the time for flowers has come again. But the time for flowers has come again.
Reading from 2 Kings. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The company of prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he answered them, "Yes, I know. Be silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men on the company of prophets also went, and stood at some distance from them as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I'm being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces.
Every day we go to war again. We assume we know so much more than them before we hear what they have to say. Headline breaks, and we start to hate again, calling them names again. We give our peace away. And I hope they see it, 'cause I wanna see it. I hope we believe it. I wanna see the love all around you. It's all around you. I wanna know that love is all around you. It's all around. Day by day, hope fades away, and then we know that there is pain within. We cannot medicate. Learn to feel, learn to begin again, and open our eyes again to see our brother's pain. I hope they see it, 'cause I wanna see it. I hope we believe it. I wanna see the love all around you, all around you. And I wanna know that love is all around you. It's all around. 'Cause I wanna see the love all around you. It's all around. I wanna know that love is all around you. It's all around.
6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead.
You don't have a job. You don't pay your bills. It won't buy you a home in Beverly Hills. It won't fix your life in 5 easy steps.
And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus Christ's sake. For it is God who said, "Let the light shine out of the darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ.
Good morning. This Wednesday, first I'm going to say right now, the smaller children, K through 4th grade, are going to be dismissed into their class. And then I will say that this Wednesday at 7 p.m., we'll have our Ash Wednesday service. You know, before I say that, actually, I want to say something else. I was just struck as I was sitting out there how wonderful it is that each one of you is here right now. We are going to witness tonight a just humongous event, right? Like the biggest event of the year in the United States, probably, in terms of money spent and people showing up and celebrities involved. And the millions of dollars for ad space purchased for the Super Bowl is remarkable, isn't it? And it's this like glamorous, powerful thing. But I want each of you to know and to be encouraged that the very power of creation rests among you and within you right now. Right? We're full of dynamic, creative power. And that's magnified in special ways when we gather together. And we're saved by the love that we have for each other. And I'm encouraged that you're here. And so I just want to share that with you, and I hope you're encouraged too. 7 p.m. on Wednesday is our Ash Wednesday service. And of course, Ash Wednesday is a day that brings us into the season of Lent. Lent is the time of preparation for Easter, where we move through spiritual places of wilderness and barrenness. And you may think, you mean all the time life? Come on, be honest. But no, it's a specific time of quiet, of reflection, of fasting, right? Times of giving something up, leaving something behind, so that we can have moments where we are open to change, the change that surrounds us that we often want to fight, to repentance, to the ability to make new kinds of decisions that maybe we wouldn't be able to make if we were so inundated with our day-to-day lives. A time where we know we have options. And Ash Wednesday is the beginning of that season, where we reflect on our mortality, part of what it means to be human. It brings us to a posture of humility. So join us this Wednesday at 7 for our Ash Wednesday service. And of course, April 16th is what? What's that day about? The Nehemiah Action. You know, do you guys remember Sunday school? Anyone go to Sunday school? When I was in Sunday school, there was always candy involved for when you would answer a question. So maybe I should bring candy and throw it out when so far Amelia would have 2 pieces. And Amelia, of course, is one of our justice leaders, so it's kind of cheating for her to answer it. So come on, everybody. April 16th is Nehemiah Action. This past week, I was able to attend the DART Clergy Conference. DART is the nationwide group of which HOPE is a local chapter. Direct Action, Research, and Training. That's what DART stands for. And the clergy conference was this past week, and I was able to be with hundreds of pastors, ministers, and rabbis from all over the Midwest and the Southeast, and it was incredible. We did text studies on the book of Mark, exploring ways of reading biblical text in their context, which of course means from the margins, as the rich and powerful did not write the Bible. We heard powerful sermons, and we had workshops on ways of connecting more deeply with our congregations around the work of justice. So needless to say, I'm all energized about it, right? And excited even more than ever. So look forward to having those conversations with me, because they're coming your way, as we all grow deeper together in our relationships, and specifically our relationships about what it means to be the body of Christ and pursue God's justice in the world. And April 16th is one small part of that work, so mark your calendars. Well, if next week is Lent, then this week is the final Sunday of Epiphany, which is the Transfiguration. Right? A story we all know pretty well, I think. Each year, at this date, we reflect on the story that you heard, Jesus being changed, transformed, transfigured on the mountaintop. And that story means what it means for us in the biblical narrative. We're going to ask, why is that story there? And of course, we'll ask what it means for our own stories. What does it matter to us? Ultimately, that's what we'll be exploring and working to answer for ourselves today. And hopefully we'll come away with something that grounds us, centers us in our work together as the church. In order to answer those questions, we're going to look first at this text from 2 Corinthians that you heard read, where we will be reminded a little bit about what it is that the work of the church even is, right? And we'll connect that to the text in Mark. And then we'll explore a little bit at the end of this story of the prophet Elijah, and hopefully from that draw out some tangible ways of following after Jesus that we've seen in the text. I hope as you hear these texts read, they're moments of reflection for you. I was sitting in the back, and as Keith was reading that story from 2 Kings, something struck me that I did not say that I wanted to say, so I wrote it on my hand. So the sermon's even longer than I intended. Our text is from the book of Mark today, is the earliest time this story is recorded, right? Mark is the first gospel text written. Matthew and Luke were written after Mark. I said that right. Matthew and Luke were written after Mark, and use Mark as a source. Mark's the earliest of the gospel text. And here's the thing. Mark, even being the earliest gospel text, is still written decades after Paul is writing his letters. Do we often think about that? Is that in your head when you hear these? Probably not, right? But the point of me bringing that up is the followers of Jesus, they didn't stop following Jesus after his crucifixion and then wait for stories to be written about him and then kind of jump back in, right? They were understanding things about Jesus, they were working out the things they had heard, and they passed down oral stories. And then, of course, the gospel writers come along in order to theologize about what's going on, in order to have these stories codified for future generations. For us, I think that's important because our introduction to Jesus is through the gospel narratives, 100%, right? Maybe you heard about Jesus and heard these stories in a Sunday school setting when you were little, but that person was referring to the gospel texts. But for early Jesus followers, these oral traditions are already in play. People who had lived with Jesus, passing down stories, giving instructions for life. And so these letters from Paul, they fit within this context, and they're referring to things that Paul has learned from other Christians, as he talks about. Or maybe things he directly experienced, as he talks about having these mystical experiences. And he's working with these ideas and these stories, and he's theologizing them, and he's integrating them into the broader movement of God's justice and righteousness in the world, as told in the Hebrew Scriptures. Right? That's Paul's Scriptures. When he talks about Scripture, is the Old Testament, as we would call it. Jesus' Scriptures, the early Christians' Scriptures, they are the Old Testament, which is a weird way of saying it because there was no New Testament. They were the Hebrew Scriptures. And Paul's letters are working from within that context. And that's important to keep in mind because for Paul, this Jesus event is telling the same story that's been told for generations, now 1,500 plus years. The story of what God is doing in the world and how it is that humans participate with God in that work. And that's what our little paragraph here in 2 Corinthians is about. And the broader section too, if you were to read it. But this little section in particular has some ideas in it that maybe we just gloss over. One little word in particular that just kind of becomes Bible-y, religious-y. We don't really sit with what it means. But I think it's important to understand if we're going to utilize this text in any real way. This text seems to be focused on the glory of God. That word glory, of course, is a concept we see in the Hebrew Scriptures. The glory of God fills the world, right? It's seen around us. Glory is talked about as something that is occurring, but also as something that will occur in the future. Promises from the prophets like God's glory will be known through all the nations. That kind of thing. And glory is often talked about in modern Christianity with just kind of the idea of praise, right? Like give glory to God might mean like say nice things about God, praisey kind of things about God. God did this or that thing for me. God rescues us, and so we sing songs about it. But that's not exactly all the nuance behind glory. The word glory, doxa in Greek, or hod in Hebrew, I think, is a quality of God. It's like a divine attribute, right? So someone like the emperor could also be talked about as having glory, as it was a quasi-divine personality. Jesus is spoken of by the New Testament writers as having glory in this text, obviously, but others, because Jesus is also spoken of in this kind of divine way. If you trace the word glory in the Old Testament, it has to do with a sense of power, effectiveness, right? The word is actually like weight. In other words, there's a presence, but an active presence. So maybe a way we could talk about glory is the active presence of God around people, among people. And of course, that comes with honor and majesty and the recognition of that presence, right? So that's where we get the word glorify from. And the word often gets taken in those directions, but when we see it in the Bible, let's think first of a manifestation of divine presence. And so when Paul is talking about the glory of God being revealed to people, he's saying the active presence of God in the world is being revealed to people. In fact, it makes sense. We could even translate it that way. If we read that verse from 2 Corinthians, it makes sense. For it is God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the active presence of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That helps us to understand a little bit more clearly then what Paul's talking about. He's basically saying, look, we proclaim to you Messiah. We say Jesus is the Christ, the anointed one. And what is happening in this anointing of Jesus, this commissioning of Jesus, is God's presence in the world being revealed to people. And some people don't see it right now, he says, right? The God of this world, whether that's Mammon or Satan or whatever, is blinding people. And certainly we see that around us as well now, right? People want to reject the power, for instance, we see in this room for something more glamorous. But he goes on. Those of you who did see it, you've been given light, right? You've been able to see something that you didn't see before. Light has been shined into your hearts and minds. And then he ends by saying that we've embraced what we've embraced, we share with other people. Which is to say, we share with other people the knowledge of an active, intimate presence, a living, substantive, divine presence in the face of Christ, in the face of Jesus. That's kind of the very baseline Christian message, right? Paul does this a lot in his works. You'll just see him kind of repeat the core kernel message of his teaching. And Paul says, we've shared that with you. We share that with everybody, in fact. And he goes on, if you were to read the part we didn't hear read after the section we did hear read, he says, we've suffered a lot for that proclamation, right? Everything we've suffered, we've gone through, and we've gone through a lot, is for your sake, Corinthian people. He says we're not in it for money or fame or fortune or something like that, right? But we do it for you. But why go through all of this for you? And Paul ends the paragraph after the one we heard by saying, so that grace, as it extends to more and more people, may increase gratitude to the glory of God, or so that the active presence of God in the world will be recognized as such. That sounds pretty good to me. right? The idea of favor, of embrace, of welcoming, the feeling like you have been accepted, all that goes under the word grace. As it extends to more and more people, then the sense of gratitude grows in our world. And people give thanks for the life that they've seen, thanks for the life that they have, that they've tapped into, rather than the lives we often want to lead, which is fleeing from life and taking shelter in isolated, small ways. The kind of life that Paul talks about is really just the recognition of God's active presence around us. It's a way of being that can be described as a participation with life itself, rather than just imagining that life is something that happens to us. And that is our mission, right? When we see the presence of God, when we realize that life is a mode of participation, that we are able to co-create with the divine, to not only see life, but to bring it and to make it and to facilitate it, it leads us to a much different place than we would normally live. As the Hebrew scriptures put it, it leads us to shalom, a place where we see each other through those eyes of grace, where we don't see the people around us as enemies or potential threats. Living in that way is really a cursed way of living. Deuteronomy, for example, speaks of this in many places, but in one place, as it speaks of how the community must care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the immigrant, it actually says, "Cursed is anyone who does not care for the alien, the widow, and the orphan among you." This is the world in which Paul's living. This is the scriptural world in which he eats and sleeps and breathes, right? And so for Paul, just like for the writers of Torah, you've got two options. You can choose to be cursed. And if we look at our neighbors around us, our brothers and sisters, as anything other than alternate images of God, if we look at them as threats or those to be destroyed or those who will destroy us, right, then we're cursed. Don't be scared away with the language of like cursing, right? Don't let your modern like mentality and sensibilities shy away from the word because it might sound too like magical or mystical or something. It is the fact that if we do not care for the least of these in our societies and in our civilizations, we are doomed. There's no way around it. It doesn't have to be mystical, right? If we structure ourselves so that some people are always carrying the burden of the rest of us, we are ultimately doomed. If you set up a culture of aggressive competition and striving against each other, then no matter what, it will lead to destruction. That's the goal. That's the goal, right? War is the goal of this aggressive posture. It's just simply the case that we are cursed if we reject the vulnerable among us. The flip side, of course, is also true. The glory of God, a world in which we can look around and see God's presence among us, is revealed as more and more people see life not as a place of who's going to kill each other first, but as a place of creation. A world that flows from God's life, that lives within God's life, and sees that in the face of Jesus. So why does that little last piece matter? Why does Paul focus on saying the glory of God revealed in the face of Christ Jesus? Because it is Jesus, of course, that grounds these ideas and returns us again to very specific physical calls from the Old Testament, who shows us what it looks like to embody this divine life, right? Because we could just sit here, and we could theologize about it, and we could use lofty language about glory, about the presence of God. We could make it very spiritual, for lack of a better word, disconnected from our lives. We might not be convinced that God's presence means care for the widow and the orphan. We might not be convinced that God's presence means a kingdom of justice and equity. We might not be convinced of those things until we see them lived out and embodied in the life of Jesus. Now maybe we can begin to answer the question, why is the story of the Transfiguration in the Gospels? Well, there's this language that's floating around, being passed around, written from Paul to the Corinthian people and shared with other congregations, right? About the glory of God, about Jesus being the face and the embodied glory. And so what exactly does that mean, and how can we show this narratively? People are telling these stories. How do we codify them for the broader community? And so the church is already talking about this. The church is already saying that Jesus is the revealed divine presence, the active presence of God in the world. And so in Mark, we have a story to display it to us. And in that story, you heard Jesus goes to a mountaintop, and he's with Peter and James and John, and they're suddenly blown away as Jesus is transfigured, transformed right before them, and he takes on a different figure, and his clothes become so white that Mark says nobody could bleach them that well in the whole world. I love that that's like his example. Like, imagine the whitest thing you've seen with bleach. Whiter than that. I leaned over to Britt and I was like, there's part of me that probably thinks the women in the community read this and were like, yeah, Mark can't get it that white, but I could get it that white, right? Mary was probably like, these idiots can't even bleach anything anyway. The other gospel writers talk about it literally shining forth light, right? Mark's just like, it was a very clean robe. But of course, we know from tradition, the idea of this white is like it's just blinding the disciples. And we know that this is a metaphor drawn from other texts, right? The Old Testament talks about this luminescent presence. Drawing our minds, of course, the way Paul talks about it. God shines light into our hearts, right? Because it dispels the confusion of not being able to see where we're going. It dispels the chaos of being overwhelmed by being tossed and turned by everything that the world gives us. And it gives us a path to walk, right? Light is something we need to be able to move forward. And so we see this in Jesus' transfiguration. Then also, who shows up but Moses and Elijah? The text tells us they're talking with Jesus. What could they possibly be talking about, right? So, who's Pharaoh in your day? And Jesus is like, Tiberius, whoever was emperor at the time. I think it was Tiberius, right? And Elijah's like, oh, how are the kings doing? And Jesus is like, you would not like Herod. You wouldn't like it, right? Maybe they're talking about their prophetic roles. I don't know. Or maybe they're just chatting. But these figures are obviously very important in the imagination of the Hebrew people, right? Moses, the one who led the people out of Egypt, who demands of Pharaoh, who tells, not asks, let my people go. Moses, a man whose story is pretty remarkable, raised in a place of privilege as Pharaoh's own daughter, right? Pharaoh's daughter found him in the river after Moses' mother refused to kill her own son at the command of the Egyptian elites. She puts him in a basket, sends him down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him and raises him herself. And so he is raised as an Egyptian noble. I mean, what a turn of events that is. And then as someone who's lived in the palace his whole life, he decides one day to go look around. It reminds us of the story of the Buddha. You ever heard the Buddha story where like he was a prince and his father, the king, kept him away from all the poverty in the streets and all of the inequality of his kingdom and all of the death. In fact, the story goes the Buddha didn't even know people died because his father shielded him from all of that, right? And one day he decides to go into the world and says, whoa, like life can't be where we just avoid all of this suffering. Well, Moses has the same experience, right? He walks around out of his place of privilege and sees his own people being horribly mistreated by the Egyptians, and sees a slave driver mercilessly beating one of his brothers. And so he kills the man, not knowing what else to do. He's just overwhelmed with the sense of injustice, right? This spark. Well, that doesn't go over well for him. He thinks he's going to be like the hero to the Hebrew people, and the Hebrews are like scared that this like nobleman just killed another Egyptian. And they're like, are you going to kill us too now? In that moment, he realizes that he's probably made a tactical error, and so he flees from Egypt. He can't be a part of the Hebrews, and he can't be a part of the Egyptians. He's in this weird middle place, and so he leaves. He settles down in Midian, he gets married, and he's just a shepherd with his father-in-law, who's a priest of an entirely different religion than the other two groups. And then all of a sudden, he gets the call, the prophetic call, to be the prophetic voice to Pharaoh, a voice of deliverance for the people out of a system of injustice. And that story's powerful. It lasts for a reason, right? Especially resonates with us, I think, who in this room are pretty privileged. For us who are being called away from inaction into a place where we can tell, not ask, the leaders to enact justice. And of course, his story resonated with the people, the Hebrew people, throughout the ages, right? And into the time of Jesus, this deliverance, this presence of deliverance, of rescue, and also the giver of the law, those guideposts, those structures, those systems that were so central and important for the Jewish people to live the kind of life where they were their brother's keeper. Integral even today for the Jewish faith. And then hugely important person number 2 is Elijah, right? The one who is said to be like the prophet extraordinaire, the summation of what it means to be a prophet. Specifically rejects any royal offer of power, stands against kings as he called for justice for all the people. And in this place of prophetic power and voice, right? He became known in the imagination of the Jewish people as a kind of promised messianic prophetic voice of the future. Yes, he was a prophet of old, but he's coming again, Malachi says. If you've ever been to a Seder dinner, you will know at the end of it, the door is opened. And the door is open to invite the prophet Elijah into the home. Interestingly, I learned this week, there's another opening of the door in the beginning where you say the bread is the bread of the poor. And a call is to go out to invite the poor into the table. And the rabbi that was sharing this with us said, don't open the door for Elijah if you didn't open the door for the poor. But that's just a separate thing that I'm sure we'll get to later in the lectionary. But Elijah's expected prophetic voice to return to deliver Judaism from its enslavement. And so we have the two of these spending time with Jesus. The voice of deliverance, the person who speaks against the powers to release the people, the embodiment of Torah, and the one who proclaims that injustice must end among the people and speaks against the Hebrew kings themselves and is a promised messianic figure. These two are hanging out with Jesus. Mark is saying a lot here, isn't he? Mark's making some big claims for the people reading this. Claims that have already been made, of course, but giving them this narrative. Jesus is the site of divine light, the return of Elijah, the return of Moses for the people. And all of this is made clear for us. And what it means begins to be made clear for us as the question of Peter and the response of Jesus are very stark. Peter wants to enshrine the place and stay up there forever in the glory of Jesus. He wants to fall down and worship or put Jesus on a pedestal, or maybe march right to Jerusalem and say, trust me, this guy needs to be on the throne. He's Moses 2.0. But Jesus says, don't tell anybody about this. Don't tell anybody about it. They're just going to get the wrong ideas. And no, we're not going to build shrines. We're not going to build any kind of holy sites on this mountain. We're not going to dedicate this moment or anything like that, try to preserve it. We're just going to go back down to the towns. And we're going to keep doing what we've been doing. Prophets don't prophesy on mountains, right? You can't have a prophet without a king. You can't have a prophet without something to prophesy against. The bringers of justice don't do it on the mountains. They go down with the people to provide that guidance. God's presence doesn't dwell on the mountain locked away behind some secret door or in a special room or in a special building. God's presence is among people. It is within and through and around us, and it is displayed in the face of Christ. So how do we do what Paul calls us towards? Where he says we show this to more and more people so that gratitude grows as we recognize that presence in the world. The story of Elisha and Elijah is really great because of how long it is. I don't know if you noticed compared to the other ones, but it was like more verses, and they just said the same thing 3 different times. First, they're in the first town, they're going to go to the second town, and Elijah says, stay here. Elijah's like, I'm not going to stay here, I'm going with you. So they walk to the town. Okay, I'm going to the next town, stay here. I'm not staying here, I'm going to go with you. And they walk to the next town. And then the next town. There's a lot of walking that occurs in this. And we're told that they talk while they walk. The story shows the dedication that the learner has for the teacher, right? We're familiar with that kind of motif in stories. But this isn't just your average teacher, right? This is a kind of messianic, semi-divine figure who's about to be swept into the heavens in, quote, a whirlwind. That's pretty wild. And then we find out that whirlwind is chariots and horses made of fire. Their journey displays for us, I think, some practical points about what it means to learn from these sites of divine focus to follow after Jesus the way that Elisha followed after Elijah. First, walking together is important. It's emphasized to us. Elijah says you don't have to keep going. Elisha says I want to. There's a sense of commitment. There's a sense of honoring the teacher. There's a sense of supporting the teacher, right? But there's also a sense of learning. This is in so many traditions. Aristotle's school of philosophy was called the walking school because it was thought as you walked together and discussed, that'd be the best way to gain knowledge. Now, am I calling for literal walking today? Yes, I am. One of the takeaways is walk. This is church. This isn't super spiritual time. This is everything time. Walk. Walking puts us in a place of learning from our environments, from God in the world. Walking with each other, which I am also advocating for, is a way that gives us the ability to talk in a unique posture. Side by side. Right? You can't walk like this. You could. It'd be weird and dangerous and you'd fall off the stairs. But when we're shoulder to shoulder, we embrace the world as it comes to us together while still being in community. So take walks together and talk. Growing with each other in community, which as we've heard is time and time again, is the most powerful place, according to Paul and the Gospels, the most powerful place to find the face of Christ. And it's also the most tangible place to learn the needs of other people. To understand what it is that drives us. To understand each other more deeply. Our values, our goals. To grow deeper in the things that will allow us to display grace to more and more people, to quote Paul. Lent is coming up. It's a time of practice. It's a time that reminds us that all of life is a time of practice. It's a time when we can do intentional practices that hopefully kickstart other lifelong practices for us, right? Walking is a practice that's physical, but find whatever else is physical for you. Whatever it is, whatever physical, actual practice or discipline that you choose to engage in to grow your faith, your open posture of listening, it has to be with other people. Sunday mornings are hugely important, which I just talked about. It's so beautiful that we gather together in these moments of being open and listening, but we have to have more than this with each other. These stories also help us to readdress how it is that we're considering the people around us, considering our own activity in the world as a chance for repentant reflection. If Christ is the glory of God, the active presence of God in the world, then we can know that God's not super into unjust systems, right? If Elijah and Jesus are sites of the Spirit, which is how they're both talked about, then we can know that the Spirit is not on board with systems of power, with government agents or agencies, or with institutional structures that we build for ourselves, churches included in that leave people aside, or that withdraw care from people, or that do not enact care for people, or that create elements of society that are devalued. It's pretty cut and dry. if there's a system that creates impoverishment or homelessness or whatever, you can bet with full truth on your side, God's not for it. God's not for that because Jesus wasn't for that. Elijah wasn't for that. If we're looking to the face of Christ for the active presence of God, we can be really, really sure that there are things that we should be working against, fighting against, and seeking to prevent because we love our neighbor as ourselves. And love means doing to others as you would have done for you. So our call then, of course, is often what it is to follow Christ into the biblical call to do justice. Not in a vague way, not in some broad way, but in listening, looking, and hearing where it is that certain people are targeted, where certain people are forgotten, where certain people are kicked to the side. And then in faith, letting love and grace guide us into work with and for those people. This path is light. It is good news for us. So may the Spirit of glory fill your hearts and lead you more deeply and fully into participation with divine life. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the gift of story. We thank you for the gift of text that